but away we go. All right, so we'll start off with descent with modification. We're powering into evolutionary theory. So this is the headstander beetle right here. Lives in deserts, and in order to get moisture, which is relatively rare in the desert, in the dawn, it stands on its head, splays its legs out, and collects dew, which it can then drink, which is pretty cool. There's 350,000 species of beetles, and they all have various evolutionary adaptations to their environment. So, statement of learning objectives, which hopefully by the end of the lecture you'll, be satisfied. So, and right into it. Evolution, according to Darwin, is 3 words. A couple answers here. So, what are 3 words describing evolution?
Change.
What? Change, that's good. Species change over time. So they adapt to their environment. The beginning of the lecture, it was titled Descent with Modification. That's a good one. And what's one of those phrases everybody uses for evolution? Survival of the fittest. Which is not the greatest phrase because it implies that only the best survive. And I like to use survival of the good enough. If you can survive, you will survive, and you'll probably breed and produce offspring. So, descent with modification is through time, species accumulate differences, genetic differences or adaptations to their environment. And over evolutionary time, new species can arise, which is pretty sweet. So, first off, we want to have a specific definition for the term adaptation. What does it mean when a species adapts to its environment? So, an adaptation is an inherited characteristic, and it enhances fitness in their specific environment. So, fitness can generally be defined, fitness, right? It can be defined as, survival and reproduction. So, if a species has some advantage in survival in its natural habitat, that is an increase in fitness. If it can reproduce more effectively in its natural habitat, that is an increase in fitness. So, we'll often use the term reproductive success here and there. So, reproductive success is a pretty cool term because ultimately, if an animal survives for a long period but doesn't reproduce, it does not add to the continuation of its species, it does not pass on its advantageous adaptations, and it just generally isn't very successful as an animal. So, animals need to reproduce. So, reproductive success is basically the success of offspring, the generations of reproducing. So, parental and offspring generations success at reproducing. So, oftentimes reproductive success is favored over survivability. If you look at a lot of invertebrates like octopus, they will live out their life for roughly a year, maybe a little longer, and then at a certain point when conditions are right, they all group together and have a giant festival of reproduction and die. So, survivability. Survival is not highly selected for. They don't survive an incredibly long time, but they reproduce an awful lot in that short period. So, reproductive success is favored there. So, it's pretty cool. So, we have some little pictures there of various animals with advantageous adaptations. So, a cactus eater has a long, sharp beak, and that allows it to tear into and eat cactus flowers and pulp. So, right here, helps it exploit that natural resource. The insect eater uses its narrow pointed beak to better grasp insects. And then this seed eater has a big broad beak in order to crush open seeds and get at the pulp. So these adaptations help them survive in their local environments. And so if a cactus eater and a seed eater are in the same area, they are not exploiting the same food source, so they don't have to compete with one another. And that enhances their fitness. Less competition for food means more individuals can survive and reproduce. So natural selection is a process by which an individual organism with favorable traits is more likely to survive and reproduce. So they have higher fitness, higher reproductive success. So natural selection enhances fitness of a population. So it's not an individual organism that evolves. Evolution does not occur at the individual level, rather it occurs at the population level. So what that means is if you have an individual with advantageous traits, it's able to survive and reproduce more effectively, so those traits will tend to increase in frequency within the population. So you have a change in gene frequency, a change in trait frequency over time, and that is evolution. Whether you're talking about in a single population over a short period of time, or the process by which one population becomes two separate species. So it's all accumulation of various adaptive traits. Those traits are favored by natural selection. So, pretty cool. So, you know, the difference between individual fitness and population fitness, or, you know, fitness and environment, this is an individual's fitness, right? But, you know, is this passed on to offspring? All right, if you exercise a bunch, get great muscle tone, do you have, you know, pumped up babies? No, those are individual traits that develop, you know, over time. They're not heritable. So, you know, run all the marathons you want. My, you know, babies will have the same, you know, chances at survival as yours. So, you know, I can just sit and watch Netflix all day. All right. So, you know, fitness is reproductive success. So there you go. The better you survive, the more offspring you can produce. Natural selection, favoring fitness, favoring traits that allow adaptation to their environment. It's not intentional, right? Natural selection is not a sentient force. You know, it's just if you are in a specific environment and something about you allows you to better exploit that environment and it is heritable, then it is passed on. So it has been selected for. So, nor can natural selection sense the needs of an organism. If an organism ends up in a new environment, natural selection cannot sense the needs of that organism and then produce a new trait out of nothingness. Organisms have to work with the traits they have available, with the genes that they have available. Natural selection modifies existing genetic variation. So, you can often think of an animal's fitness as, energy, right? So an animal has a set amount of energy. They spend energy undergoing the chemical reactions that are just a part of living. But then they have to spend energy foraging, right? So you spend a little energy undergoing those chemical reactions. Then you undergo a little energy foraging, avoiding predators, the various things that deplete the energy available. And then you have the energy available for reproduction. So if you have adaptations into your environment, you may spend a little less energy foraging. Little sip there from the energy. Little less energy having to survive, right? The environment is harsh, but you have adaptations to it. So a little less energy to survive. And then you have a ton of energy available, well, not a ton, but you have more energy available for reproduction. The less energy you spend on the basic requirements of staying alive, foraging, fighting, reproducing, those are, the big debts of energy. The less you spend, the more you have available for reproduction. So, pretty cool. When we look at, the theories of how traits are inherited, Darwin's theories on inheritance were pretty awesome. But there were explanations before Darwin. For instance, a scientist named Lamarck came up with Lamarckian inheritance. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So he was explaining variation in a population and how characteristics were inherited. And he came up with the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So you have this little giraffe ancestor, and it's grabbing some leaves, but it's having to compete with various other animals for leaves at this level. So it goes, and then stretches its neck a little. Then it can get to those leaves. Then it stretches its neck a little more and gets to those leaves. So this was also the idea, behind if you're incredibly physically fit, your babies will be more physically fit. So the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And as we know, that's, some bunk. But they didn't know about genes. They didn't know how inheritance worked. So it was a hypothesis about, an explanation of what they saw. Darwin was much closer to the correct answer. In fact, Darwin pretty much had the correct answer, but he did not have a knowledge of genetics. So he didn't know what the unit of inheritance was. He wasn't hanging out with Gregor Mendel and Mendel's pea plants. So he didn't know what an allele was. He didn't have the term genetics out there. But he did know that certain traits are inherited to the next generation. And so those inherited characteristics are separate from, acquired characteristics over time. If you work and you get higher fitness, that is not transferred to your offspring. It is only various inherited characteristics that are transferred, not acquired characteristics. So, something was passed on. So it's pretty cool that Darwin came up with the correct answer, without even knowing what a gene was. So he hypothesized about what was inherited, even though he had no real idea. So when we look at natural selection and variation within a population, we can talk about what's required for natural selection to act on variations. Because there's various variations within a population that natural selection may have no effect on. So, in order to be affected by natural selection, A, you must have variation in specific traits within a population. So there have to be alternate versions of a trait in the population. Maybe alternate coat colors. So there are variations on that trait. Those variations must have an effect on fitness. So some variations may have a negative effect on survival and reproductive success. Some variations may have a beneficial effect on survival and reproduction. They must affect fitness. And last but certainly not least, those traits have to be heritable. You have to be able to pass them on to your offspring. So, if you have variations on coat color, and some of those variations are more effective camouflage, then they are selected for. And if they are heritable, of course. So, an individual with more effective camouflage may have a greater chance of surviving, and better chance of surviving, the better chance it has to reproduce. And so that trait may become more common in the population because it has a positive impact on fitness. If you have a trait that has a negative impact on fitness, it will tend to become less common in the population because those individuals with a negative or a maladaptive trait will not be able to survive and reproduce as effectively. So there are various traits in populations that are absolutely not affected by natural selection. By default, anything that is not inherited is not selected for. But even inheritable traits with variation, you will not see natural selection if they have no effect on fitness. Modern humans, with our various eye colors have no effect on fitness. So, once upon a time, they may have had an effect on fitness. So you may have seen geographic variation in eye color, but nowadays it has no effect, and so natural selection does not act on eye color, and so eye color is essentially inherited randomly in the overall human population. So, we have some various evidences for the natural selection. One is in artificial selection. So artificial selection is governed by humans and human choice, human, intention. Natural selection is governed by the environment and the various organisms to which you are exposed. Artificial selection is humans monkeying around with an organism. But through artificial selection, we can actually examine the amount of genetic variation that can be inherited within a population. For instance, if you just look at all dogs, they are all descended from a wolf ancestor. Wolves tend to have some, highly conserved traits. They all tend to look alike. You may have slight variations in coat color, but wolves have very similar features throughout their populations wherever they are found. But when humans domesticated them and then started breeding them for specific traits, we were able to pull out all these various traits, producing all these separate appearances and, various traits from those ancestral organisms, that ancestral wolf. So you can see that there is a tremendous amount of genetic variation that was present in that wolf ancestor. So it's actually quite interesting to see just the amount of variation hidden in the genetic code that can come out under the correct conditions, can be favored under the correct conditions. So you can have very short coats and very long coats just within those populations. So very cool. And of course, not to leave plants out of it, we see examples of artificial selection in wild mustard. Wild mustard, very small, unassuming plant. You can throw it in a salad if you find it. But various people at various times actually looked at wild mustard and started growing wild mustard and selecting for various traits. Producing, selection for stems, getting the kohlrabi. Flowers and stems, broccoli. Selection for the apical tips, the buds from which new stems grow, gets you cabbage. The side buds gets you Brussels sprouts, and the leaves get you kale. It's all wild mustard, but we've selected it into various different vegetables, which is pretty awesome. When you eat kale, you are eating the same species as cabbage. So, really cool. There are various other examples. So wheat, wild wheat, sheds its grains at maturity. So once reproduction occurs and you have fertile seeds, they're dispersed. So you don't get access to those seeds, so you cannot eat them and get the nutrition from them. So we selectively bred them so that modern wheat does not disperse its seeds. The seeds stay on the stem so that we can then harvest it. So, pretty cool. I always like to throw this one up. It's an example of artificial selection in Novosibirsk, Russia. So in Novosibirsk, Russia, around the time of the rise of Stalin, he talked about the equality of all people and that, there's no difference in people. And he actually banned the study of genetics because genetics focused on the differences in genes between people, and that was not part of the rhetoric of the time. And so there was this scientist who wanted to study the genetics of domestication, but he couldn't say, give me money for studying genetics, or Stalin would have thrown him in a prison. And so he said, hey, I want to breed more docile foxes for the fox farm so that it's easier to get their pelts. And they're like, hey, that sounds great, you do that. And so he started breeding these dogs, or these foxes, red foxes from North America. So this is the same species as a red fox you'll find in North America. They were exported to Europe for fur farms, and he started breeding them for friendliness, essentially. So if there was a fox that came closer to humans than other foxes, he bred it with another fox that was willing to come closer to humans. And that was essentially the one thing he bred these foxes for, friendliness. And over a relatively short